I did not expect that those would be the first words my sister would say after calling me at 3:47 a.m. this night. She didn't even say hello, and her voice was so frail. It was feeling as if she was screaming through a whisper, as if she was uttering the words on her deathbed. "Who's in your backyard?" I asked. She couldn't reply. I could just hear her muffled crying. "Is it Maria?" I asked. I had the feeling it would be her, but my sister remained silent. Maybe it was someone else. Thinking about who it could be gave me chills. "Have you called the police?" I asked, and her voice immediately started shaking as she was trembling while deeply inhaling and exhaling. "But please, don't call the cops," she uttered. I killed her." My heart stopped upon hearing it. I didn't even know what to think. But then, I remembered my sister's paranoia and delusions. I needed to know somebody else's perspective. At that moment, a part of me was genuinely hoping that she had just forgotten to take her medications, and that she was hallucinating some horrifying incident. I promised her that everything would be okay, and then called her husband. No answer. I called a few more times. All unanswered. At that moment, I needed to call the police. I told them where my sister lived and that she has seen someone suspicious in her backyard. I also explained that she was suffering from severe postpartum depression and that she often forgot to take her pills. I wanted to be sure whether this was a genuine threat or if she had just hallucinated. The dispatcher told me that one vehicle would be sent to investigate, but I couldn't wait. I had to see if my sister was okay, so I quickly put on some clothes and went to the car. It would take me an hour or so to arrive at my sister's house. As I was driving, I started recollecting all the events that happened since the birth of her daughter on March 19th. My sister had a natural birth, and her firstborn was a healthy little girl. Her first month in recovery at the hospital went fine. Her husband was a supportive and friendly man. She was relatively wealthy, and her boss was willing to let her take off as long as 6 months to care for her newborn. But after about a month, she began experiencing strange feelings. She was always tired and anxious. Her feelings were quickly transforming into paranoia. She was almost certain that something horrible was going to happen to her baby. She even believed that she would cause it. Her husband saved her from ending her life twice before realizing that she needed serious medical care. At her psychiatrist exam, she was diagnosed with postpartum depression, and her case was extremely severe. She suffered from delusional thoughts, was feeling suicidal, and her husband worried that she might hurt the baby. However, after she was started on therapy, everything seemed to be fine. She spent the maximum time off given by her boss with her baby, and both she and her husband enjoyed bringing her up. I loved the little cutie too, but one problem arose in August. My sister needed to get back to her job on August the 12th. As her husband was also working, and working 2 shifts as a doctor, there was no way that he could be taking care of the baby. They needed a babysitter. This is when my sister's delusions and paranoia came back. She didn't trust a single person enough to take care of her baby. I couldn't help, as I also had my job, but I began searching everywhere to find a babysitter that she may approve of. After days of searching, I found the woman named Maria, who seemed to be doing babysitting professionally for a relatively low price. She seemed very nice on her Facebook page. She was currently unemployed and looking for a job. Her previous job involved taking care of a little boy who sadly passed from a brain tumor. My sister did not trust her a bit, but there was no more time for her to search, and Maria only had good reviews. The best advice I could give to my sister was to call her and arrange a test meeting. She agreed, but only because she was running out of time, and babysitters. I couldn't be there when Maria arrived to see them for the first time, but my sister's husband told me that she was a sweetheart and a really good woman. My sister, however, was feeling very uneasy about the fact she'd have to leave her daughter to this woman. Of course, she was paranoid. And it turned out that she indeed was. Maria was a great babysitter. My niece loved her, and she would also clean the house and cook, even though this wasn't in her job description. but my sister believed that Maria was too perfect. If somebody is that nice, they have to keep some dark secret, she would often say. Nobody could convince her otherwise. I had told her 100 times that if she really disliked Maria that much, she could find another babysitter. But she was determined not only to discover Maria's dark secret, but also to use it against her, so that her evil kind would never be able to babysit again. To convince my sister, last weekend I called Maria. I asked her to go on a coffee or lunch with me. She was very scared at first, but ultimately she agreed when I told her who I was. She also told me that my sister was acting odd around her. I couldn't wait to meet her and explain why she was like that. Our meeting happened in a very busy fast food restaurant. She was a bit late, but when I saw her, she truly stunned me. I thought that my sister was suspecting that her husband may have cheated on her with Maria. She was gorgeous, tall, with waist-length black hair and big blue eyes. We chatted for a few hours. She was a joyful, witty, and nice person. I explained my sister's condition, and she was absolutely supportive. She even described me her daily routine when she babysat. There was nothing unusual or unsettling. Just a normal day starting with breakfast, playing around, going for a little walk, lunch, then my niece would fall asleep and Maria would tidy up. That was all. When my sister or her husband arrived home, she would just take her pay and leave. Of course, that my sister was delusional, this woman was a professional and a very kind soul. The day after, I called my sister to tell her about my conversation with Maria. "Did she show you her Instagram?" was her first question. "No," I replied. "Why would she?" My sister immediately sent me the link to Maria's Instagram. There, oddly, was just one picture. It was Maria in her kitchen cooking some fish. There was absolutely nothing else, not even stories. This was confusing to me, as Maria was a young and beautiful woman. I expected that she would have had tons of stuff there. But no, just one photo. I don't know why, but it unsettled me. "Have you seen the satanic symbols in the background?" my sister sent me in an SMS. I stared at the background for a few minutes, but I couldn't find anything. There were just kitchen tiles, white with some red triangles. But they didn't form any kind of symbol. I told my sister that she was just acting insane and to leave Maria alone or find another babysitter. She screamed at me about being uncaring and blind to the obvious. We hadn't talked again until this night. I arrived at my sister's house at 4:36 a.m. The police were already there. They told me that they had found my sister in the basement, curled up and crying. She was screaming that she doesn't want to go to jail, and she was uttering something about how she was a murderer, but she had no other choice. She had to protect her baby. The police then talked to me. They told me that they had found no evidence whatsoever of any kind of violent crime happening inside the house. Everything was orderly, no blood, no murder weapon. My sister was holding a kitchen knife when they found her in the basement, but it was completely clean and it was evident that she hadn't washed it. They told me that my sister needs more psychiatric assistance. "But who was in her backyard?" I asked. "Nobody," the policeman replied, "and her baby is perfectly fine. I don't know why she's acting this way." At that moment, my sister's husband came back from the hospital. He saw me and immediately apologized. "I had a complicated surgery at the time you called me. I really couldn't reply. What happened here?" The police told him the story they told me a second ago, and he was also very worried for his wife. She obviously had a psychotic episode, similar to those she had had a few weeks after labor. But my sister took out her phone and showed the policeman Maria's Instagram. She screamed, "She was in my backyard, this disgusting old hag." All of us just looked at her confused. "Sis," I said, "I know that you're jealous of Maria, but this is an exaggeration." "Yes," added her husband, "saying such a rude thing to a gorgeous blonde like her is a bit too much." I thought that I hadn't heard him right. Maria had very dark hair. Nobody could mix up a blonde with her. "What do you mean by blonde, sir?" the policeman asked. She obviously has dyed purple hair. What? Sir, I beg to disagree, my sister's husband continued, but she is clearly a pixie-cut blonde. Pixie-cut? What are you all talking about? My sister screamed. She's old. Her hair is gray and long. Are you insane? At that point, I realized that something was going on, and I didn't like it at all. I told the police that we'd take care of my sister, and that she probably hallucinated the whole episode. The policeman was still confused, but he told us to call if something similar happens. I asked for some time alone with my sister, and took her to the kitchen where the window was facing the backyard. What exactly did you see? I asked her. She told me that she had come home early. She was feeling completely broken. She tried to unlock the door of her house, but it was locked. Then she tried to call her husband, but he was unavailable. She figured that Maria was still inside, so she tried to call her, but she didn't pick up either. My sister then tried banging on the door, but nobody heard her. She was overwhelmed by fear at this point and was determined to enter the house, even if it meant that she had to break inside through the window. She chose the window of the living room, and what she found odd was that the TV was on, but nobody was watching it. She then decided to peek through every window to see what was going on. The house seemed completely empty and tidy. Every speck of dust was removed. There were no toys on the floor. It all seemed too clean, especially for a house with a crawling baby. But then she looked through the kitchen window. At that point, she broke into tears. Maria was there, she cried. She was eating my baby. I felt my heart sinking. There was something about this that deeply unsettled me, even if it was just a hallucination. My sister broke through the kitchen window screaming. She took a knife and chased Maria to the basement. There she caught her and began violently stabbing her, but she was completely bloodless. And she was smiling. My sister tried killing her with all sorts of things she had blindly grabbed in the darkness. She wrecked a metal pole on her head, but Maria's eerie smile just wouldn't go away. As a last resort, my sister took a lighter and tried to set the monster on fire. But she didn't burn, she just disappeared. Then, my sister rushed upstairs to check on her child. The baby wasn't in the kitchen, but she saw through the window an ominous figure staring. Maria was there, smiling and watching her. At that moment, my sister had a mental breakdown. She ran to the basement, hid, and called me. But before calling, she probably cried for hours. That's how the police found her. But your baby is completely fine, I said. She was found in the crib, sleeping peacefully. Are you sure you haven't dreamt of all that happening? My baby is not fine, my sister whispered through cries. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to upset you, but last week she fell onto her knees, crying and screaming. She was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Her husband entered the kitchen upon hearing her screams and crying. I knew that they didn't have enough money for therapy. I was feeling such emptiness in my heart. It's so hard to describe. My little niece has a deadly disease. It feels so hard typing it out. It's all her fault, my sister continued crying. Haven't you seen her satanic Instagram? That image where she cooks fish? I asked. She isn't cooking fish, my sister exclaimed. She's sacrificing my baby. I rolled my eyes and took the phone. I needed to open that image and explain to my sister that it's all the work of her paranoid mind. I dropped the phone. I wish I could show the picture. That was not a kitchen. That was my sister's basement. Red decorations were symbols, similar to runes, written in blood. And instead of fish, Maria was cooking my niece. I descended to the basement to tell myself that all this was not real. I turned on the lights, but everything seemed normal. Have I lost my mind as well? I promised my sister that I'd ask everybody that I know to financially help her to get therapy for her baby, and went home. All of this was way too paranormal for me. But as I sat down to write this, I noticed somebody through the window. The figure was human, but only vaguely. There was something odd about it. It was changing constantly. But I noticed another thing about it. It was smiling. And I knew it. Guys, I need help. She's standing in my backyard. I sat back, intrigued. He was tapping the corners of the table. Left, right, left, right, left, right, in perfectly spaced intervals. It was almost hypnotic. It wouldn't have caught my notice if not for the look of utter concentration and anxiety on his face as he tapped carefully with the 2 fingers of each hand on each corner. I put my shades on so that I could observe undetected. I'd bought mirrored shades just for this reason. I'm not a creep. I just like to watch what others do, the quirks they have, and the little details in their actions. Okay, I realize that still sounds kind of creepy. Well, it's people watching anyway, and nothing more. I find human behaviors fascinating. The door to the train carriage slid open, and the noise of the tracks and buzz of conversations crowded in. I looked at the passenger opposite me, still dedicatedly tapping on the table's corners, but now with an increase in the intensity of his frown. "Hi there," a chirpy young lady was at the door. Her presence poured into the room, energetic, lively, unstoppable. I contemplated pretending to be asleep. Then I saw the distress rolling on the tapper's face as he tried desperately to keep his beat going, determinedly ignoring the lady. I sighed, then plastered a bright smile on my face to match her sunshine vibes. "Hey, we've got the bottom bunks, hope that's all right. Both top bunks are free for you to choose." "Great, thanks," she smiled at me. Then her gaze drifted to her fellow carriage bunker. She looked confused, then concerned for a moment. She opened her mouth and I immediately spoke up again. "Let me help you with your stuff." I grabbed hold of one end of her heavy backpack. That did the trick. She shifted her attention back to me and grabbed hold of the other end of her backpack. We heaved it onto the upper bunk. "Thanks," she looked back at the tapper. But this time, she didn't try to say anything. She just raised an eyebrow, then turned to climb up the ladder to her bunk. I looked back at the tapper. He was now saying some words in time to the taps. Each word spat out with a tap, in a curt, almost frantic manner. I couldn't help it. I wanted to look away, leave the carriage, give him some space to do whatever it was he needed to do. But I was getting really curious about the tense word he was expelling under his breath. So instead, I shifted from my comfortable space at the end of my bunk and sat at the table opposite him. I put my head down on my side of the table and pretended to take a nap. I could now make out some of the words. Do not never. I couldn't tell what the rest of the words were. He was pronouncing the words in slightly varying ways, as if attempting to say them in the perfect way, enunciating every phoneme the words held. I kept my head down, just listening to his words and taps, and without realizing it, somehow drifted off. I don't remember what I was dreaming about, except for the last scene. I was walking down some steps and realized that the ground wasn't there. I walked off the last step and fell. I jerked awake. I must have startled him. He stopped his tapping. He looked at me as if registering my presence for the first time. We stared at each other for a moment or two. Then he looked down at the corners of the table. I could already see it happening, him getting distressed about his tapping ritual being disrupted and falling back into a frenzy of tapping and chanting. "Hey, nice to meet you," I said, before I could think it through. He looked at me with a tinge of surprise. In the bunk above him, the lady turned to her side and looked curiously at our interaction. "Hey," he said softly, looking nervous and uneasy. "Where are you headed to?" I kept my tone light, pretending not to notice his hands clutching the corners of the table. End of the line. Oh, that's a good 2 days away. Yeah, he said, nervously running a hand through his hair, then immediately gripping tightly onto the corners again. Hiya! He turned around quickly at the sound of her voice from above. The lady was climbing down the ladder to join us. Great to meet you guys, she chirped. Her enthusiasm seemed to physically repel him. He leaned away from her, while still holding on to the table's edges. Hey, you're up. Nice to meet you too, I said. She gave me a wide grin, which faltered a little when she turned to him. He did not meet her eyes. His tension and anxiety were palpable. Well, I'm going to have an early dinner. Check out the food at the dining car. Do you guys want anything? No thanks, let me know if the food's good. I kept my voice upbeat, matching her energy. She smiled and gave me a thumbs up, then left the carriage, closing the door behind her. There was a long silence after that. He seemed stiff, unsure of what to do. I was pretty sure he was fighting the overwhelming urge to tap on the table corners again. It's important to you, tapping the table edges and saying the words just right. I kept my tone as nonchalant and non-judgmental as possible. He looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and anger, which quickly dissolved into puzzled wonder, as he realized I was not making fun of him. Yes, I need to say it just right. I need to tap it just right. I need to do them both just right. I wanted to leave it at that, and go back to my relaxing journey to my next destination. It was, after all, a year-long break for me, my epic vacation. But my professional instincts took over. Why do you need to do them just right? I just need to. He stared resolutely down at the table. What would happen if you didn't do them just right? He seemed discomfited by the very thought. He shook his head. That's not okay. It won't be good. What if you didn't do them at all? I could almost swear I saw the color drain from his face. Bad things would happen. What kind of bad things? I don't know, but bad things. Very bad things. I know it. I nodded. It's a terrible feeling, you know something horrible would happen. You stop. You refuse to do it. And you can feel the dread in your body. The inexplicable, paralyzing fear. It builds until you snap and do whatever it is you need to do to ease it again. He looked at me with the first signs of actual interest since our journey began. Yeah, exactly that. I nodded again, then added, I was that way with lights too. I had to switch my lights on and off, until I was thinking exactly the right thought, in the right way, while the lights went off. Otherwise, I was convinced horrible things would happen. I smiled gently at him. But one day it got too much for me. I didn't want to live my life repeating my actions over and over to ward off some unnameable event. So I just stopped. I switched off the lights while thinking a bad thought, sat down, felt the fear come crashing down on me. I felt like I was suffocating with fear, with horror, with this intense dread that convinced me that I would deeply regret not getting things just right, that I had somehow caused some horrible destruction. I looked up at him. His expression was unreadable. But nothing happened, I continued. Nothing bad happened, even though it felt so real, felt like it was going to happen. He stayed silent. I cleared my throat nervously. I've worked with others too, who had these issues, when I was a psychologist. They felt these things too, the fear, the terror, the urge, the need to do whatever their fear was telling them to. I trailed off. His expression was becoming a familiar one. He was frowning. He seemed to be finding the right words to say. You're describing OCD. I know that I seem like I have OCD. I've been diagnosed with OCD. It's not OCD. He began tapping again. How is it not like OCD? I'm sorry, I didn't want to jump to any conclusions. I just want to understand what's going on. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. all the while still tapping. It was a long while before he spoke. When I stop tapping, bad things happen. Or they begin to happen, but I've always stopped them in time by tapping again. Could you tell me more? Tap, tap, tap. At least he wasn't back to spitting out those words. I've tried to stop before. Of course I've tried to stop before. You think I don't know how I look to others? You think I want to live my life enslaved to these acts? I want to hang out too. I want to talk to others. I want to be normal. But I can't. I've got so fed up. I've tried to stop so many times, but every time I do, something happens. I didn't speak, just waited for him to continue. Weird things happen, strange things that I can't explain. His breathing was quickening. He was obviously terrified by his recall of the past. I tried it once at home when I was still a student. I fought it when the urge came, when the fear hit me and I knew that it was time for me to tap again. I knew I needed to do it. I tapped for a bit on the sides of my bed, then I stopped. It felt wrong, all sorts of wrong. I felt terrified, but I refused to tap anyway. Then the room just started creaking. The floorboards did, my cupboard, my desk. Everything was creaking. Then my textbooks fell off the table. I had to start tapping again. Something horrible was going to happen, I knew it. I started tapping again, and it all stopped. I kept my face neutral, unassuming. I nodded. I tried another time when I was dating this girl, and I just wanted to be normal, to have a proper relationship, to not have to run away to do my stupid rituals when the urges hit. Then we started hearing footsteps. We didn't know where they had come from. Just footsteps near us, though there was no one else. The footsteps got louder, closer, and I had to go. I had to leave. I ran off and found this lamppost. It felt right. I started to tap on the sides of it, and it stopped. The footsteps stopped. I was starting to feel a little bit unnerved. That must have been terrifying. It was tough enough for me to stop having those things happen. It must have... No wonder you couldn't stop. My words seemed to hit him hard. He started blinking away tears. It was really tough, but I want to stop. I want so badly to stop. I want everything to go away. I want to be normal. I want to be free. I want to be able to have a conversation with my train mates. I want to walk to the dining car, have a meal, and not be stared at like a freak. The tears kept spilling from his eyes. I felt a tingling, salty sensation at the back of my throat, and a heavy pull on my heart. Do you want to try? Here? With me here? We could face it together. His tears gave way to proper sobs. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there looking at him silently. When his sobs subsided, he lifted his reddened eyes and regarded me for a while. I do want to try. Please. Maybe it'd be better with someone else around. I let out a small sigh of relief. I was hoping he'd be willing to try. I couldn't deal with the thought of him going about his life living the way he did. I just want to point out another thing that could help us along, I said. He watched me expectantly. It can really help to think of what's the worst thing that could happen, then compare it to your life as you're living it now, and be okay with the worst thing that could happen, to rather face that possibility than live as you're living now. He seemed uncertain, scared. For me, it worked. I thought, well, the worst that could have happened would have probably been someone dying, the world ending, severe injuries and whatnot. And I realized I'd rather just let it happen, get it over and done with, than to keep doing these gestures, these repetitive actions, being slave to my fear. I needed to be done with it, whatever the cost. He considered my words with a grave expression. Then he nodded. I'm willing. It's been so long. Too much. It's not allowed me to have a proper life. I smiled at him. Then let's do it. He looked at me, still tapping the sides of the table. Then his jaw tightened, and he nodded. A few moments passed before he stopped tapping. He put his hands flat on the table. We waited. The first few minutes seemed to take an immense toll on him. His face was pale and cold sweat beaded his face. His breaths were shallow and quick. More time passed, and he seemed almost ready to relax. Then the lights in the carriage flickered. He seemed to almost jump out of his skin. He reached out his hands to the corners of the table, but I grabbed him and placed them back on the top of the table. I pressed down on them for a while, then let go. He had to do this himself. The lights went out. I took a few deep, calming breaths. This was a coincidence. I knew it, logically. This was a highly unfortunate coincidence. But that was all it was. And if I could help him through it, he could be free from these obsessions and compulsions for the rest of his life. Or at least be less controlled by them. I grabbed his hands to make sure he didn't start tapping in the dark. He whimpered a little. He couldn't see my face, but I smiled at him nonetheless, hoping that I could send him some reassuring vibes. Then the train juddered to a halt. I began to feel the cold pricks of sweat on my own face. I realized my face was tensed up, my grip on his hands tight. I forced myself to relax. He grabbed onto my arm once I lessened the pressure on his hands. Despite my fear, I felt heartened. He was determined not to tap, no matter what. We sat in the dark silence, ignoring the aura of doom and fear that had settled around us. Then we heard the breathing. Something was breathing heavily on the bunk above him. A cold needle of fear pierced my heart. We stayed incredibly still. The breathing came downwards. Whatever it was right next to him now. We could hear the rough wafting of air as it breathed onto his face. I heard his breath quicken as his hands clamped painfully on my arms. He still wasn't tapping. I felt a deep respect for him even as I contemplated my impending doom. Then the raspy breaths of whatever it was shifted. It was by my right ear now. I could feel it. It was strangely cold. Every time it breathed in, there was a wet, rattling sound. When it breathed out, my ear was grazed by a sharp, cold gust. It stank. It had a horrible, rotting stench about it. But still, we grabbed hold of one another's arms, refusing to let go, refusing to tap. I don't know what came over us, what made us so emboldened as to continue resisting despite the insane things going on in our carriage. That was a mistake. Its cold, mocking voice slithered into the quiet of our carriage. You will suffer. I was beyond convinced at this point that this was anything related to OCD. Are you willing to pay the price for your insolence? It hissed. Do you accept credit cards? The words slipped out of my mouth before I could stop it. My blood froze in my veins as the possible repercussions of my stupidity struck me. Then the carriage was flooded with light. The lady was back, our savior. Hey guys, the food was great. She took in the scene of us clasping each other's arms in death grips. Oh wow, okay, you guys sure bonded without me. The cold, heavy air began to disperse. A light whisper caressed my ears. I'll be back, for you. Then it was gone. Its presence ebbed away just like that. He looked at me with shock and relief on his face. Yeah, we did, he said, smiling at me in gratitude. A pure joy began to light his face. He looked like a whole different person. I smiled back at him, shrugging off the disquiet I felt. We did. Normally, I don't pick up hitchhikers. By rule, I don't think it's worth the risk when, if someone truly needs a ride, they can call an Uber or Lyft and be off in 10 minutes. However, while on a quick snack run last month, I made the mistake of breaking my rule when I approached a young woman who was walking alone in the pouring rain. At first, I fully intended to drive by, as I would have with any other person. She must have noticed me driving up, because right as I came up on her, she spun around, nearly jumped in front of my car, and frantically waved her arms for me to stop. As I screeched to a halt, she ran up to my driver's side window and started on a tangent about how her phone died and how she was still 6 miles away from home. Her face was obstructed by a mask, oversized hat, and dark glasses, so I couldn't glean any semblance of sincerity from her facial expressions, but I could hear the desperation in her voice. Dumb of a decision as it was, I didn't feel right letting her walk home in the rain without a phone when she was clearly begging for help. This is on top of the fact that I didn't exactly have anywhere else to be at 1 a.m. I opened the door, and almost as soon as she entered the car, she asked for me to go straight. As I drove, I tried to make conversation with the stranger, but I never could get an actual response. The only reply I'd received was, "I'd like to go home. Please help me get home." Eventually, I just gave up entirely. After around 10 minutes of driving straight, I asked if it was supposed to be turning anywhere, but was met with silence. I turned towards the woman for a brief moment to repeat my question, but instead slammed on the brakes when I laid eyes on her. All the items covering her face had been removed to reveal a completely smooth surface. The only hint at some approximation of a face was the slight rise and fall of veiny skin where her mouth would have been, almost as if she was imitating breathing. Instinctually, I put the car into park and moved to run out, but before I could even touch the handle, a large hand clamped around my arm and held me in place. I was close to having a full-blown panic attack, but she raised a gnarled finger to non-existent lips and made a quiet shh sound. When she spoke, her voice had taken on a much more gravelly tone, and the pressure from her voice grip forced me to take every word with the utmost respect. "You will not leave," she stated. "You must drive. You no longer have a choice." When she released her grip, I didn't say a word. I didn't even want to comment on the apparent bruising on my arm, for fear she'd do much worse if I complained. I simply exhaled, put the car into drive, and kept going. We must have driven for another half hour. She'd occasionally tell me to take a turn here or there. Still, after about 15 minutes, I knew we were headed towards the more rural parts of the country, an area where people were known to go missing. With every glance in her direction, I could see her featureless face was trained on me. It was as if she was observing me, not entirely sure of whether or not she could trust I'd take her wherever she'd wanted to go. And as soon as that trust was broken, it would very quickly be over for me. Eventually, she instructed me to pull up to a lone, run-down house just off the highway. The windows were boarded up, and I could see piles of trash strewn about the exterior. When we stopped in front of it, she told me to get out. An unconscious shake of my head prompted her to slam her giant fist on the dashboard, cracking the plastic. Without argument, I walked out into the cold night. She followed behind and pointed at the house. In silence, we walked into the decaying building and were immediately met with a groan. I shined my phone's flashlight forward and saw what appeared to be a homeless man writhing around on the ground, in pain. He was foaming at the mouth, and his eyes were bloodshot. I gasped and took a step back onto some glass which alerted him to our presence. He turned to me and begged for help. He begged for me to call an ambulance or at least take a message for his kids. He began rambling about how he'd made a colossal mistake, and unfortunately he never got to finish what he was saying. The woman pounced. In the blink of an eye, she was on top of him, her hand contorted into a claw that wrapped entirely around his face. 13 grotesquely long fingers held his head down as he struggled against her ungodly strength. He tried to fight back, but the weak man's struggles were met with even more force. The creature upon him was determined to lap up every last breath, and I swore I could hear a twisted chuckle as it watched him cling to life. The screams seemed like they went on forever, but in reality it was quick. Maybe 30 seconds had passed, and he was gone. When she retracted from the body, a quick shine of my phone's light revealed a broken jaw, a twisted nose, and deep bruising around the neck. The woman faced away from me, and for a moment we both just stood there in that horrible place. I tried to find my voice. I wanted nothing more than the strength to tell her that all I wanted to do was go home and pretend like that night was all a nightmare. But I didn't have to. Reminiscent of the way she turned to me on that dark, rainy road, she spun around and revealed not just a large smile, but a brand new face. One that greatly resembled that of the man she had just taken from this world. Her parting words to me in his voice were, "Thank you very much. Never return here." With that, she simply walked further into the decaying structure. As soon as she was out of sight, I sprinted back to my car and sped all the way home. That night, I must have quadruple checked all the locks, taped the curtains down, and left a pile of makeshift weapons by my bed. Every single dream I had for the next month consisted not just of visions of her, but of many more creatures like her. And honestly, despite it all, I still never wanted to tell anyone. I want nothing less than to be another random guy throwing a story in the sea of tall tales. I knew that anyone I told this to would roll their eyes and tell me that I'm being ridiculous, or that I needed to be drug tested. I'd rather just avoid the scrutiny entirely. But just last week, a man was found dead in his home, clearly suffocated, jaw and nose broken. No tips have led to anything significant. The police's only hint is a crappy video of some young man who was described as appearing featureless being dropped off near the home. Funnily enough, just last night, I saw a post on one of those community apps saying that someone in the area thought they saw the murdered man walking the streets. Turned out to just be a young man who looked remarkably similar to him. After hearing that story, I think I feel a little less crazy going public with this. To the man I enabled the death of, I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing something good. And as a result, it ended in tragedy. I would never forgive myself for that. I don't know what you were going through, but you deserved so much better. And to the world at large, if you're in a situation where someone is trying to hitchhike with you, please keep driving. During my senior year of high school, I made the worst mistake of my entire life. A mistake that I credit every following regret to. A mistake that I obsess over every night. A mistake that always lingers in the back of my head. It was a game. The blinking game. It started in December when I had just moved across the country to a rural town in Kansas. It was for my father's work, something like that. A decision that I wasn't too keen about after having to transfer schools in the middle of the semester. I was en route to graduate top of my class previously, and I never considered changing that mindset until he came into my life. I've repeated the first day of my life 1,000,000 times. I should have chosen the chair in the front, or maybe one by the window, any other place than besides him. But instead, I dropped my backpack next to his desk and sat down beside him. "Hi, my name's Aaron," were his first words. Soon enough, Aaron and I became fast friends. We shared almost everything in common, from our interests to our hobbies, talking all through class. One day after school, on our typical walk home together, Aaron stopped and looked to his left, to an old ranch that stood vacant in the middle of a field. "Have you been yet?" Aaron asked, his eyes still stuck on the house. I shook my head. It was an old farm back in the day, owned by the Ravenwood family. We should check it out. Aaron could sense my curiosity, and he let his backpack fall off his shoulders before stepping over the worn chicken wire fence and onto the yellow grass. "Are you coming?" he asked, and I couldn't say no. The house was surrounded by an old and unkept cornfield. The corn had long rotted, and as I waded through the yellow stalks, it felt like they were wrapping around my legs, pulling me closer. The farmhouse shared a similar face of age, its wood walls having long decayed, windows boarded up or broken into after years of vacancy. After stepping onto the porch, I turned around, facing back to the main road through the obscurity of corn, but it was as if the stalks blinded everything, and the street was almost entirely invisible. Aaron caught up to me before peeling the aged door from its long, undisturbed place against the frame. The inside wasn't much different from the outside. Slanted wooden beams shot across a decrepit foyer, leading me further into the house. In what remained of the living room, graffiti was painted across the walls, trailing up the stairs and into the hallway above. Aaron motioned for me to follow him up, and I rashly obeyed. "This is where the game begins," he said, pointing to a doorway at the top of the stairs. I moved forward and hesitantly looked inside. The room was empty, spare a mountain of corn sitting on the windowsill. At the base of the stack, the corn was black and rotted, and at the top, it looked similar to the appearance of those I just saw outside. People still do it, I guess. "Do what?" I asked. "The blinking game." Aaron approached the corn before letting his backpack slip off his shoulder. From the side pocket, he took out an ear of corn before placing it on the top of the stack. "Do you want to join?" Aaron asked. "It's my first time, too." I paused before nodding, but I had no idea what that game even was. He pulled out another ear and placed it on top. "The game is simple. Starting now, every time you blink, she gets closer. No one knows where she starts, but if you start to see blackness obscure your vision, you know she's near. If blackness consumes your vision entirely, she wins." I couldn't understand anything Aaron was telling me. "Who's she?" "Ida Ravenhood, the daughter who was buried alive by her own family in the 19th century, or so the story goes. Just remember, you can't leave the game. Either Ida wins or you die. You can't let her catch up to you. She moves every time you blink." "What?" "Look, it's not difficult. Don't blink that much, because every time you do, she gets closer. Just avoid her. When you see a black object, that's her, and you need to get away. And remember, you can't talk about this to anyone. It's a rule of the game, and if you break it, you'll disappear." I blinked. "You can't do that anymore, Steven. She's already getting closer to you. Look at me. I'm not blinking. She's gonna get to you first." Aaron rushed out of the room before flying down the stairs and out the front door. I blinked again. I didn't believe his stupid game. Days passed with no incident. While Aaron continued to occupy all class time talking about it, the game had almost slipped from my mind otherwise. I never felt any fear. But after a week went by, I first encountered it. I then realized that I had a lot to fear. I was in the hallway leaving school for the day when I saw a black shadow in front of me. It stood at the end of the corridor, large and threatening, almost like an ink blotch on a piece of paper. It had no form. It was incomprehensible. I blinked, trying to understand it, but it moved closer, occupying more of my vision. I rushed out of the main doors and outside, where I found Aaron starting home. He picked up on my urgency, his eyes following mine as they darted back inside, quickly able to understand where my explanation fell short. "You saw her," Aaron said, barely able to complete his sentence before I grabbed his arm and started pulling him forward. I needed to get away as far as possible from the figure. We rushed forward, running past the farm into my house not too far after. I left Aaron at the door and rushed up to my room, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I didn't experience any more of the blackness that afternoon. Not only that, but I found a loophole too, where if I slept it only counted as one blink. So that week I spent most of my time away from school and the black figure. When I did return to school some days, I'd see Aaron, who had long abandoned his usual wittiness in place of a more silent, tired conduct. When I talked to him, he too expressed encounters with the shadow, explaining that he would often have to leave school halfway through the day just to get away from it. After a few months had passed, I had gotten to a point of depression where I wasn't able to make myself get out of bed, and instead I opted to sleep for most of the day, hoping that I wouldn't encounter the figure. I had occasional run-ins when my parent had forced me to attend school, and in those situations I had always skipped, opting to walk across the town to gain some distance from it. I had asked Aaron on multiple occasions about the figure, about a cure, about what happened if it caught you. He mainly brushed off my concerns until one day he finally sat me down to answer all of my questions. There isn't a cure, not that I'm aware of. Everyone who has ever participated in the game has either died, disappeared, or continues to run from it like cat and mouse. And that's why you don't want it to catch you, because if it does, then your fate is worse than anything imaginable. Then why did you even play it in the first place? I asked, moving my lunch tray out of the way. Why did you even make me play if you knew how bad it was? It was the thrill. I grew up here. I've heard stories of the blinking games repeated 1,000,000 times over the years. You saw that stack of corn, Stephen. You know how much people want to play it. You're a fucking idiot. I know that now, Stephen. And that was the last conversation I ever had with Aaron. I barely graduated a few months later, receiving some of the worst grades I would have ever imagined receiving. But I was fortunate enough to be accepted into a university abroad, where I could study without the fear of encountering the entity for a long time. I thought I had finally ended it. A few months following, I got a message on Facebook from a friend in high school with a link to a news article. I clicked it unsuspectingly, only to be brought to a website with Aaron's face plastered across the page with the words, "Missing 22-year-old found dead," beside him. I scrolled down, my eyes skimming the words, before I came across a photo. It was an aerial shot looking down into a field where a black bag was laid across the earth almost forebodingly. It was the Ravenwood Ranch. Aaron had returned. That was a week ago, and there aren't any more updates about him. I've been sleeping most days since, hoping to forget about him, but I can't. For a while, I wondered if the game had died with him, freeing me of the figure and all it represents. But last night, when I was in the kitchen, I saw it. The horrible blackness occupying the doorway, staring at me. It had been 2 years since our last encounter. I managed to flee to a hotel nearby where I'm typing all this out, hoping not to even see a glimpse of it. My eyes hurt, and I don't know what to do anymore. I just want to blink.